An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
This is the iconic phrase found in the Old Testament, embodying the principle of Lex Talionis, the law of retaliation. An eye for an eye ensured proportional punishment to fit the crime, aiming to curb violence and prevent excessive retaliation. Found in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, an eye for an eye was one of many civil laws given to the Israelites by God through Moses during the famous Exodus out of Egyptian slavery. For centuries thereafter, an eye for an eye was thought to originate from Mosaic law, but that assumption was challenged by an archaeological find in modern-day Iran in the year 1901. A far more ancient set of Mesopotamian laws inscribed on a basalt stele containing virtually the same words, an eye for an eye, inscribed on what we now know today as the Code of Hammurabi. Now, it's important to say that this discovery doesn't undermine the divine inspiration of the law of Moses. Rather, it enriches it. It shows that the law wasn't born in some vacuum, but was part of a long-developing history of moral thought. Important enough, evidently, that Jesus himself would go on to quote an eye for an eye over 1,000 years later in his most famous sermon, reframing its intent to teach a profound lesson of faith. It is also important to contrast how the same phrase, an eye for an eye, has different nuances and application between Moses and Hammurabi. So let's trace the origins and development of this ancient principle and show how an external law written on stone gradually became an internal law engraved on human hearts through the agency of Jesus. In the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers cradled the world's first cities, Babylon was a modest settlement around 1800 BC, roughly the same period that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were active. From this humble city arose Hammurabi, a minor king whose major vision had lasting impact on the ancient world. Like every other Bronze Age ruler, Hammurabi was a warring king, but his legacy is remembered in his legal code, the Code of Hammurabi, which established one of the world's first comprehensive systems of justice and order, setting the foundation for future lawmakers and societies. In the city of Sippar, in a temple to the sun god Shamash, Hammurabi erected a towering basalt stele inscribed with nearly 300 laws, most famously containing the laws of retaliation, such as an eye for an eye. At its top, Hammurabi stood before Shamash, receiving symbols of divine authority, signaling that these laws carried sacred weight. The code's prologue declares this.
Anu and Bel named me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince who feared God, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked, that the strong might not oppress the weak, to rise like the sun over mankind, and to lighten the earth.
This code introduced proportional penalties for crimes like theft, false testimony, or even disrespecting parents. Yes, cursing one's parents was seen as just as egregious as killing them. But the law wasn't just concerned with punishment. Hammurabi also aimed to safeguard the vulnerable in society, especially the widows and orphans, a concern echoed later across the entirety of the Old and New Testaments. Hammurabi's laws were revolutionary for the time, binding society under a shared moral framework meant to outlast any particular ruler's lifetime. Though Hammurabi's empire later crumbled and his set of laws became lost for centuries, its rediscovery in Susa in 1901 revealed striking parallels with the laws of Moses, who would take an eye for an eye to a different level of meaning. Some 4 centuries after Hammurabi, the Israelites, led by Moses, received their own divine law. Born in Egypt and raised in Pharaoh's court, Moses became God's chosen standard to mediate this law, ratifying it atop Mount Sinai, where God gave Moses the sacred tablets, not merely as a set of divine rules, but as part of a living covenant, a sacred bond meant to be lived between 2 parties. Unlike Hammurabi's code, which had a more external focus, the Mosaic law aimed to shape a holy people, set apart as a just society. The eye for an eye motif of Moses mirrored Hammurabi's principle of proportionality, but it carried a deeper purpose. In reflecting God's justice, it naturally fostered obedience to and trust in Him. So when Moses declares an eye for an eye, it's not a law simply about regulating behavior. It was about living out a covenantal identity according to a holy standard meant to align human hearts with God's will. In this way, the holy laws of God knocked on the heart of human beings, but couldn't enter it fully until the right time. By the 1st century AD, Judea groaned under Roman rule as its new province, being a nation with loyalty to Moses on one hand and resisting radical change in the other. Many Jews yearned for a Messiah who would inflict retaliation on Rome itself, wielding an eye for an eye to punish oppression with violence. Into this world stepped Jesus of Nazareth, whose teachings turned messianic expectations upside down, reframing an eye for an eye in a new way. In his famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addressed the law of retaliation directly.
You have heard that it was said, eye for eye, and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also.
This wasn't a rejection of the law or the abolishing of an eye for an eye. Far from it. This is what makes Jesus' message so powerful, in that the only way to stop the never-ending cycle of violence is through rejecting external retribution or internal transformation. It is a radical call for mercy to triumph over judgment. Jesus taught that true justice doesn't flow from a disposition toward vengeance, but from a heart transformed by love and holiness, so that the one who trusts in God's perfect justice will naturally walk out the law that Jesus came to fulfill. The rejection of retaliation leads to redemption both for the victim and for the oppressor. The Mosaic law, like Hammurabi's code, set boundaries to limit harm, but Jesus revealed the deeper intent from the beginning, to cultivate a character that reflects God's character. Jesus embodied this in his own life, showing what an eye for an eye can truly mean, by refusing retaliation even during his own execution, by bearing the punishment of sin, taking the eye for an eye that humanity deserved. Jesus completed what the law required, demonstrating a better way to live, the way of sacrificial love. This is how an ancient Mesopotamian law becomes the blueprint of faith, engraved on a renewed, beating heart.